a 2-minute video that I will skip by because of the research methods and the IRB approval. I cannot allow the video to be recorded. That's okay, I'll just skip by that slide.
Do you want me to not record until the video's over and then I'll?
As luck would have it, it's right smack in the middle of my presentation.
Oh, I'm sorry.
That's okay. I was debating anyway, so I'll just skip by it. It's just a short, it's a fun little, but we'll just skip by that. So thank you for notifying me that you'll be recording so that I do not break IRB protocols. Now, will I be able to share my screen?
Yes, I can do that. Let's see if that allowed you to do that.
Okay. What are folks, are you seeing?
Yeah.
Yeah. Yes. Perfect.
Okay. You see my slide deck now?
Yep.
Okay, as I'm getting myself organized here, I can, because I am screen sharing, I'm limited in how many of you I can see at one time. So I will just say, if folks have a question, feel free to unmute yourself and ask it aloud because I won't see any electronic hand raising or physical hand raising while I'm screen sharing. So that's great. I have planned for question and answer period at the end as well, but by all means, if somebody has a question, feel free to stop me and ask that question.
Jen, would you like one of us to manage questions through the chat for you, or do you want to pull off the chat yourself? What would be most helpful?
Yeah, if you could manage that for me, because when I'm screen sharing, I don't see that. So that would be great. That would be great. So thank you for inviting me here with you today. I'm just kind of curious, how many folks, now that I just said that I can't see you, I'm gonna go in and put you and cover my screen here for a second. How many folks have heard of reframing aging already? Some? Any base knowledge or at least heard of it, right? Okay, that's helpful for me, thank you. As I said in my introduction, I am co-director for the Center on Aging and Community Living at the University of New Hampshire, as well as the coordinator for the New Hampshire Alliance for Healthy Aging. And so the New Hampshire Reframing Aging Initiative is part of the body of work of the New Hampshire Alliance for Healthy Aging. So I will start at the beginning, since there's many folks that have not and are not familiar with the Reframing Aging Initiative. This initiative is actually a long-term grant-funded social change endeavor, which is designed to improve, or if you will, reframe the public's understanding of what aging means and the many contributions that older people bring to society. So ultimately, this understanding will counter ageism and guide our nation's approach to ensuring healthy and productive aging for all people across the life course. So just a brief disclaimer before I move on. So I have been trained as a reframing aging facilitator by the National Reframing Aging Initiative and the Frameworks Institute out of Washington, D.C. But to be clear, I am not an employee of either the Frameworks Institute or the Reframing Aging Initiative. And so anyone who is trained is asked to make that clear as part of their presentation. And also I want to share with you a website. I'm hoping today that I will really just whet your appetite for reframing aging. And so if you are interested in learning more, you can find it at the website reframingaging.org. The work currently of the Reframing Aging Initiative is conducted through the Gerontological Society of America on behalf of 8 national leading organizations on aging. And so this work really began in 2012 when these 8 organizations that you see here represented here on the screen got together in recognition of the fact that there are many misperceptions across our country about aging, and that those misperceptions are often resulting in ageism that impacts how older people age and live in society. So what you see on this slide is credit to those who are those organizations that are currently funding this initiative. And you see down at the bottom some additional support, and we have some local funders here in New England with New Hampshire's Endowment for Health and the Tufts Health Plan Foundation. So I mentioned those 8 leading organizations that really got together to form the idea and identify the need for an initiative that looks at how we all talk about and think about aging on a national level. And so those 8 funders partnered with the Frameworks Institute in 2014. And so the Frameworks Institute is a nonprofit think tank with the mission to advance the nonprofit sector's capacity to reframe social issues. The Frameworks Institute had long been doing this and across a variety of social issues, including climate change, early childhood education. And so these funders really decided it was time to reframe the conversation around aging and funded the Frameworks Institute to conduct seminal research on public attitudes about older people and the aging process. So now that I've kind of told you a little bit about the initiative, got through my required slides that I have to do at the beginning of every presentation, I want to move into talking a little bit about what we mean when we say framing or reframing aging. So framing is really about choices. There are a set of choices about how to present information. So this is what you choose to emphasize, how you choose to explain it, even what you choose to leave unsaid. So everybody frames, we all frame every day because we all make communication choices, whether or not we're conscious of them. Just going to advance this through. So the Frameworks Institute, I talked about that seminal research. The research that they have done really takes 2 parts. And so the first part was research that largely included on the street interviews with the general public across the country. And so that piece of research really looked at and identified how the general public views aging in general. The second part of the research looked at communication techniques, frames, if you will, to alter this public perception, in particular where there are misperceptions around aging. So to test whether one of these frames works, so a new way of communicating, whether or not that works, the frameworks conducted large-scale experimental surveys that measured people's policy preferences after their exposure to a particular framing strategy. So then the researchers analyzed the people's responses against a control group that received no prime to measure the difference in their knowledge, attitudes, or policy support on an issue. So what you see for statements on the screen are examples of the kinds of statements that survey participants responded to on a Likert scale after being exposed to a new frame or a short passage about aging issues framed with one of the candidate framing strategies. So when a frame works, people's support for these kinds of statements goes up compared to the control group. So they went through that process, and some frames actually did not work. And so they have identified, and so later on when I share some recommendations about things to advance in our communications, I'm sharing this slide with you so you know that they have been tested quite thoroughly before they are put forward as a recommendation. And frameworks controls for demographic variability in its experiments so that the only frames it recommends are those that work across demographic groups. So I'm going to pause for a second. I could spend probably 3 hours just going into the research alone on this. I won't. I recognize that folks usually fall into one category or the other. You're either really love research and want to know every detail, or you are just prefer the high level. So I'm going with the high level. That website I shared earlier, reframingaging.org, is a place to access more information on the research if you're interested. So moving on to the theory of change, of how frames can drive broad social change. As we change how we communicate about aging, we influence the public discourse about aging, which in turn shifts public thinking about aging, resulting in greater support for aging policy and programs. So I'm going to go into a little bit of what that research tells us about what the general public thinks about aging and why, before I move into a conversation about what the research recommends we can use for frames. Okay, so what we see here is on the left, what the general public, what the research tells us that the general, I'm sorry, not the general public, that the experts, advocates, so those people who work in the aging field, whether you're a volunteer or just a community or a community advocate or a leader in an organization, the tendency to view aging in this group is that aging is normative. There's thinking that we should embrace aging. We know there are challenges, but there are things that we can also embrace. There's the view among experts and advocates, aging is all of us, as well as the understanding of how we age is driven by social factors. And then finally, the view that there's so much we can and should do. Now, if you move to the right here, you can see the general public's view, again, based on interviews and the research by the Framing Institute. We know the general public tends to think that aging is all bad and it's all about decline. There's also the thinking that we must fight aging, and a tendency to view aging as something that's happening to someone else. It's another category. Regardless of how old we are, that's not us. The general public also tends to strongly think that how we age is really just driven by our individual choices. And finally, the prevailing attitude in the general public is that we're doomed. It's all about decline and negativity. So a primary reason that framing matters is that communicators face a big challenge, and it's one we can call a you say, or we might say we say, they think problem. So that's where you, as an expert, someone in the aging field, puts out a message that sounds perfectly reasonable to you when you're in your office or you're talking to a colleague, but that somehow elicits a completely different response from your intended audience, from the public audience. So you say A, and the general public hears and interprets it as B. this you say or we say they think problem is really driven by culture. So what we know is that in the absence of knowledge about an issue, the public tends to default to culturally dominant assumptions about the world and how it works to reason about unfamiliar or complicated issues or ideas. And so anthropologists call these assumptions cultural models. And we can think of them really, though, as mental shortcuts that help us process information faster based on our expectations that come from our past experiences or prior understandings. So really, in short, cultural models help us interpret and organize information quickly. There's benefits, there's to cultural models, but they often sacrifice understanding for efficiency. Because they're largely automatic assumptions that can get in the way of real, deep, engaged thinking about an issue. And so this can have implications for advocacy communications or policy communications because those default assumptions can obstruct people's ability to interpret your message the way you want them to. So we all have cultural models and we all use them to make sense of unfamiliar ideas. So really the salient point here is that our minds aren't empty fish bowls in which you can drop a message into without interference. So the framework uses a metaphor to talk about all these cultural models of aging in our mind. And the metaphor that they have constructed is the metaphor of a swamp or a swamp of aging. So if you think of our minds, instead of being like fish bowls, our brains are more, and if you visualize a swamp, an actual rich ecosystem with lots of flora and fauna. So this cognitive swamp, if you will, just like a real swamp, is filled with nice things like orchids and flowers, and dangerous things like alligators. So our minds are filled with these models, those pre-existing expectations that, like orchids, can be fruitful for the messages that we're sending into people's minds, or models that, like alligators, can be harmful and cause misinterpretation of our messages. So as communicators, whenever you speak or write about your work on aging issues, it's important to remember you're sending those messages into a swamp filled with pre-existing ideas and beliefs and assumptions that can alter how your message is heard. So I'm going to skip by. And so what I'm skipping by is just a short video. It's about 2 minutes that really highlights some of those on the street interviews that I talked about. So those interviews with the general public, and you get to see some themes emerge already in some of those interviews with people prior to receiving any frames of some of these cultural models. So typically I share that prior to walking through these cultural models on aging. So I'm going to take a quick pause. I just pulled up the group so I can all see some faces for a brief moment so I can check in. It's a lot of information. It's much easier to deliver in person where I can interact with folks and see you. So I just want to check in and see at this point any questions or comments. Okay. Great. I'll keep moving. And I recognize that nobody has anything else on their mind today, right? Especially today. So thank you for showing up and for listening to me today when I know everybody had so much on their mind. I'm going to minimize you all.
This is really good though, Jennifer. I mean, I know we have things on our mind, but I think we'll all enjoy listening to this and hearing about this.
Great. Thank you for that feedback, Joy. I appreciate that. So what you see on your screen here is the cultural models, or the swamp of aging that has been identified by the Frameworks Institute through that research. And I'm going to walk through this relatively quickly in the interest of time, and just kind of give a high-level overview of some of these cultural models that have been identified. What you see in blue are those cultural models that we can liken to the alligators, if you will, sticking with that metaphor. So these are the predominant beliefs and automatic assumptions that people hold that often cause them to misinterpret or cause misperceptions around aging. And then I'm going to touch briefly on the ones that you see in red, which are the things that that are cultural models that are held that we want to try to tap into in our communications. So I'm going to start at the top with the category called us versus them. And so it was identified that the general public, as I have already said, really views aging as something that's happening to someone else. So it's not happening to all of us, rather it's happening to them, this distinct group over there. And so the challenge is when that happens is folks don't get engaged in the issues of aging because they're viewing them as issues that are somebody else's issues. It also tends to trigger zero-sum thinking. And what zero-sum thinking is this is the idea that resources are finite. And as such, if we give to one group of people, such as older people, then we must be taking from another group of people. And so we see this a lot when we are trying to engender policy support, resistance, because the assumption is that if we give funding towards aging, we must be taking it from somewhere else. And finally, in this category, there's some predominant assumptions about older people's digital competency level. And so older people are generally seen as digitally incompetent. The second category, again, that we need to keep in mind as we frame our messages that attitudes that people hold is the attitudes around individualism. So the general public, unlike experts and those working in the aging field, tend to attribute aging and how successfully we all age to almost completely down to lifestyle choices. There's a lack of understanding and understanding and acceptance of the level that social determinants of health play in the aging process. So again, we want to be careful not to tap into or trigger these cultural assumptions in the way we frame our communications. And so we often see an example of this. We often see the assumption that if someone has financial resources when they retire, it must be because they planned well and they made great choices throughout life. Again, there's not a recognition of all the many factors that occur throughout our lifetime that can influence whether or not we're able to retire with financial resources as we age. I'm going to shift to the top left and talk a little bit about...
Oh, I called the wrong thing. I'm sorry, Val. Bye.
A little bit about the cultural models around ideal versus perceived real aging. So
Oh, okay.
the research tells us that the
No, I have him right here. Do you think people come in before 10? I was gonna do them when I sign off, but I can actually run up and get them from Danielle now, the pins.
Hey, Anne, you're unmuted. I don't know if you can hear us.
Kelly, can you hear me?
Yeah, you're great. I'll try to text Anne.
Okay, I was getting a message that kept saying the host is muting you. So I just clarifying. Okay, I will keep going. Thank you. So the general public tends to view aging as either one of two extremes. So the extreme of, and so we've all seen these photos in magazines and everything. So this is the idealized view of aging and retirement, where, you know, a man and woman jump on the back of a Harley and they're riding into the sunset to perpetual cruises and a life of leisure. And so that's the idealized view of aging that people hold. And then on the other extreme is this perceived real view of aging that people hold, which is one that is really focused on aging as solely deterioration, nothing but loss of control, increasing dependency, and a predetermined process that, you know, there's nothing we can do about it. It's all going to be bad. So the research tells us that folks will either put aging into one of those two categories, and more predominantly into the perceived real category. And then research also has indicated how the public thinks about solutions. As we have heard already, the general public tends to think of aging as something that is bad and negative. It's about deterioration. So there tends to be a fatalism approach to solutions for aging issues. And that is that nothing can be done. We're all aging. What could we possibly do? And then the other approach that is seen in how the general public sees potential policy solutions for aging is that really it can be summed up in, if people just made better individual choices and planned better, then we'd be fine. So the general public tends to think that if the only salient solution really is to provide more education to people so that they can make better choices and planning. And so we all know, again, going back to those social determinants of health and the broader view that those of us in the aging field take, we all know that it's not that simple. And so where we have seen, and as aging advocates and experts, we want to create urgency around our communication. In creating urgency, though, we need to be careful not to tap into this fatalistic approach that the general public has. And so we see this sometimes when we talk about our demographic shifts. I know there's been a past, and I'm sure you've all heard at times the aging demography being equated to a natural disaster. Right? And so the intention there is good intentions. As aging experts and whoever created that originally, the thought was, let's create this urgency that people will understand. But really what the research tells us it does is we're not engaging folks into our policy solution. We're actually pushing them away by creating a crisis so big that they think, I'm out because there's nothing that can be done.
Jen, are you referring to the silver tsunami?
I am referring to that. I intentionally don't say that because in my mind, every time I say it, I reinforce it. So, but yes, absolutely. That is one great example. We've heard in the past, you know, it actually being compared to a super virus. Obviously that would be terrible in this particular pandemic time. But also another example of communication, while well intended, doesn't engage people the way we would hope that it would. So the final category here is this idea that that the change in society is what is the problem. Again, that our society has changed, our families are dispersing, economics are not what they used to be, Social Security is doomed. Again, if we tap into that in our communications, we lead our audience back to that fatalistic, there is no solution kind of thinking. So that's, we want to, the research tells us with the testing with the general public is that we should try to avoid anything that would trigger those cultural models. And then what we see here in red is the ideas that we want to advance. What surrounds us shapes us. So we do know that the general public has experience with the concepts of social determinants of health. Particularly, they have been introduced widely when in referencing early childhood. So we can build on that beginning understanding of the social determinants of health when we communicate on aging and develop and encourage a recognition that there are many aspects outside individual choice that influence and affect how we age. We also can build on and shift the thinking away from us versus them to the concept of collective responsibility and the idea that we are all aging. So oftentimes when I do these presentations in person, I will start out by asking an audience, how many of you are aging? Raise your hand. Because it's that immediate trigger of, it is all of us, regardless of where we are in our lifespan. Aging is something we're all doing. And so aging issues are important to everybody. And we have a collective responsibility to ensure that older people are able to age well in our societies. And then the final category is this idea of what we want to advance, or we want to trigger this cultural model of problems can be solved. So while we know that sometimes in our communication we can trigger fatalism, we can use these references that trigger that, particularly when we're talking about the demography, we also know that in our culture, in our society, in America, we have a general cultural model, which is that of we're problem solvers, this can-do attitude. We as Americans have shown ingenuity over time to solve many problems. So we want to tap into that in our communications and trigger those cultural models as opposed to the negative cultural models. So I'm going to take another quick pause there because that is probably the most dense slide I have. That's a lot of information. That's basically summing up all of the research that the Frameworks Institute did to see if there's any quick clarifying questions about these cultural models before I move on.
I have a quick question, Jennifer.
Okay.
What do you call seniors? Do you call them seniors or do you call them something else?
Yeah. So this is a great question, and I've left this out of my presentation for two reasons. One, for time, and also because this is a piece of the framework's research that has most been misinterpreted. So there was research done that looked at the use of terms for older people and how they are associated with an age versus competency. So in trying to determine what is the most effective term that isn't associated with complete incompetency or isn't associated with an age that's far younger than what we are typically talking about. And so the term that tested out the strongest is older people. So when this research was first released, and so the term seniors was associated with an older age bracket. So not like, because some terms actually the general public associated some of the terms that were tested as 45 to 50, beginning at 45 years old. And so those working in the aging field know that when we're talking about older people, we're not talking about 45-year-olds typically when we're talking about our programs. So seniors tested out as the age bracket we typically refer to as associated with above 65, but it also tested out with being associated with a lack of competence. So the term older adult or older people tested both as being associated with an older demographic and also with still being tied to viewing that age group as competent. Where this gets the misperceptions around this is, so the research was never saying we have to drop all of these terms. We must immediately strike them all from our language. It's just, again, it's more information for us as we choose our frames, as we make these decisions knowing that this research is there, but it does not mean we have to suddenly, if the name of our program is the Elder Law Institute or something like that, it doesn't mean we have to immediately strike elder from our name, or that these terms are necessarily bad. I know that's a long-winded answer. That comes up very often. Does that answer your question, Heather?
Thank you.
Yeah. So my takeaway there for folks is everything that we talk about with reframing aging is a process. So when I started out, I talked about this being a long-term social change endeavor. So changing the conversation, even within ourselves in the aging field, takes time. So this is meant to be the groundwork as we shift our conversations to get us thinking over time. And so that applies to how we refer to older people in general as well. So I'm going to move on to the next slide. So I'm going to talk about, so we've talked about those cultural models. I'm going to talk a little bit about how do we change this conversation about aging? What are these recommended communication tactics? And what does a new story about aging potentially look like? So as communicators, we already know that storytelling is powerful. I know many of you, I'm sure many of you, I've heard, I do it myself in writing grants or talking about programs, we tell stories. So what the SWAMP and the cultural models research tells us is that it isn't enough to just tell any story about aging, because what we know now is a poorly framed story can impede our audience's reasoning about our issue. So instead, we're encouraged to ask ourselves, what is the story going to do? What will its effects be on my audience? And the best way to answer this question is to test the effects of a story empirically. And that's what the Frameworks Institute has done for the aging field. So what you see here is what, it's a formula, if you will, for that effective story. So this is an example of the components of an effective social issue narrative. So this cuts across all social issues. This has been tested, as I mentioned, Frameworks works across many complex social issues. And it's been tested to show that it builds understanding, shifts opinions, perspectives, and generates support for solutions. So this is the formula that we can follow, and I use formula loosely, maybe guidelines that we can follow in crafting our story about aging moving forward. And so like any good story, there's a beginning, a middle, and an end. And so the research tells us that stories are more impactful if they have a beginning that answer the question right off the bat, why does this matter? And so the research also tells us an effective way to do that is to use values. And so values are a broad category of cultural ideals, or enduring beliefs that orient individuals' attitudes and behaviors. A value that tested well for reframing aging is the justice value. So lifting up that we all deserve the opportunity to age well in our communities. Again, tapping into that justice value. As we move to the middle of our narrative about aging, we want to answer the question, how does this work If it's not working, why not? So again, if we remember the general public, in a lack of information, will default to those predominant cultural models. So we can use examples, metaphors, and explanatory chains to be really clear as we're trying to engender public support, in particular policy support. And again, we want to finish our story with answering the question, what can we do about it? And so here, we want to offer principles, efficacy, and solutions. And so we know there aren't always solutions. We may be telling a story about a specific aspect of aging that we don't yet have a solution for, but we want to build into our communication that there are possible solutions. And that, again, going back to those negative cultural assumptions, that, that we can solve some of these problems. I'm going to skip by this. So moving towards a summary of what is recommended to avoid in our communications and what we can potentially advance to move our messages in the way that we intend them to be heard. If we look at the avoid section, we want to avoid tapping into the idea that individualism drives aging outcomes. Avoid tapping into this commonly held belief that aging is 100% equivalent to declining. Well, we know in our work there is decline. We're not taking away the idea that frailty exists, and some of our programs exist to help people who are declining and experience frailty. We are just, the recommendation is to avoid positioning it all about decline, because those who aren't experiencing decline or don't have someone in their sphere who is, will then see older people and aging issues as an other category. And it shifts people into the us versus them, and we do not build public will for our issues, for aging issues. We want to avoid aging. As I talked about before, the demography is a crisis, and rather we want to talk about being planful, and the impacts without creating that crisis mode. Again, avoid the concept that there's fixed finite resources where folks then have to choose where they position their support, and avoid talking about ageism as another ism. Again, it taps into the idea that it's not a fixable problem. We want to advance context shapes decisions and outcomes. So lifting up the social determinants of health models. The future is a time for improvement. Again, tapping into this idea that we can collectively all be striving to improve aging for all of us across all of our communities. And we can position that we're better off by being inclusive. Interventions, so we want to highlight those interventions that do change outcomes. And we want to focus on stories that include solutions. And that includes stories around systems and support. So I know in particular in the world that I live in, it's very much a grant-driven world. And we like to tell individual stories. And where we have shifted to, as our understanding of reframing aging has grown, is we don't necessarily remove those individual stories because they are impactful. We just make sure that we tie them into the broader societal and systemic context so that people can relate those stories to their lives and the communities they live in. And we want to advance an understanding of how ageism works. I'm being mindful of time. So Frameworks Institute has, as I've already said, a variety of resources if you want to dig in deeper. I can send out to Kelly this quick start guide, which sums up a lot of what I've been talking about instead of using this language, maybe try out this language in your communication. So I'm happy to send that up and follow up. And then I just wanted to let folks know, so these presentations that we do on Reframing Aging range anywhere from a presentation like I am doing here with you all today to 8-hour workshops. There's a lot of material here. And so we custom tailor it. I'm hoping that I'm whetting your appetite for more information. And so I want to make sure that I give you additional resources if you're interested. And one of the things that I think all of us has likely recognized is the increase of ageism during the time of COVID-19. As we hear people make comments, you know, such as it's only impacting, you know, and the general public tends to use the word elderly rather than older people. You know, why should we change how we're living? Older people should just lock themselves in their homes until this is over, and that way we can all live our lives. So we've seen this increase in ageism, and so the Frameworks Institute has responded with some communication recommendations how we can position our communication about older people during the time of COVID to counteract some of this ageism. And it taps into some of these positive cultural models that I've laid out. And it really is positioning it so that we minimize the general public's tendency to position COVID-19 as an us versus them, as we've talked about in the swamp. And so the recommendation is to use a common good framing. So this we and us, and we're not just protecting older people. These safety measures and precautions during the time of COVID protect all of us. And when we're all protected and safe, we all do better. That's a really high level touch on framing in the time of COVID. The Frameworks Institute, and if you, again, the website is frameworks.org, and you can just Google Frameworks Institute and you'll get to their website. They have one-page issue briefs that break down some of the topics that are rising up in the time of COVID. You know, whether it be some of the examples I just talked about, or framing around nursing homes in COVID, and the tendency to frame nursing homes as all bad, due to, you know, the infection control struggles in some facilities. So I will skip through this and let folks know. I will send Kelly some of these resources, but you see the website down here at the bottom, and you can see examples of some of the issue briefs they've created. And I invite folks to check them out for more information. So with that, I want to stop sharing so I can see everybody's face. I think I've used up my time here, and see if there are any final questions or thoughts. I've stunned everybody into silence.
Yeah, Jennifer, I've got actually several thoughts as a sort of a long-term resident of the swamp, going through the start of it, the process, and being in there. Those of us who are in the swamp sometimes feel that there are people walking through the swamp, examining us, looking at us and making some suggestions and so forth. It would be good for all to have a delivery system from what you've laid out there available to residents of the swamp to know that there are people working on these issues. And how can us residents of the swamp deal with the professionals who may or may not be embodying some of these characteristics, that we don't start thinking that, well, the whole world is thinking one way or the bad way, and there are people working on a different way. So, and I know your presentation is primarily for the professionals here who are dealing with the older people, but we're all going through this, and it's difficult for the residents to understand what that process is as they come to grips with it. And to know that this sort of effort is going on outside would be very useful, I think, in some fashion.
Thank you for your comment, and
Yep.
that's a great point. So let me say two things. One, that this particular presentation is geared towards professionals. I mentioned earlier that we can adapt these anywhere from, we do long extended workshops to we adapt to the audience. So I have delivered this to folks at senior centers in a variety of different other settings. What I also want to comment on, though, is we are early on, in my mind, in bringing this initiative to New Hampshire. And so I really highlighted at the beginning the national level initiative. And so I will share with you that we have funding, due to funding from the Endowment for Health, we have purchased a membership into that national initiative, which gives us technical support here in New Hampshire, as well as it gives some training capacity from the Frameworks Institute. We now have 20 trained facilitators, such as myself, to be an army to go out, and we are building out a strategy of how we bring this initiative and change the conversation here in New Hampshire. We're still early on, so I appreciate that feedback, because we will likely incorporate suggestions such as yours into our strategy of how we bring reframing aging to New Hampshire.
Yeah, I think working through the support groups, the various support groups in the state, is a good way to get these points across to people who are dealing with it on a daily basis.
Yes, thank you for that feedback. Joy, did you have a?
Well, I just have a question. So this is all great. I mean, I'm so glad that we're working on it. And I really like that metaphor about early childhood education. You know what I mean? Because I think that helped, because I think, I don't know, I've heard of it, you know what I mean? And you know, for many years. I guess my question is there anything doing at the national level to like put out, you know, videos or commercials or anything like that to get this out on a more global, you know, initiative or something like that, to bring in it to more mass people?
So I can tell you on a national level, the GSA, the Gerontological Society of America, has been working on building up the infrastructure and supports in individual states across the country. There hasn't been a sort of national marketing or public-facing marketing. What there has been tactics to bring it into spheres that maybe aren't public, if you think of a commercial or something of that. So there's been influence in the APA guidelines. If you now, those have been revised to include the reframing recommendation. So more, again, at the professional level, targeting the field first, as we change our conversation, so that we are all have unified language before the positioning goes really broad scale publicly across the country. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I mean, I guess that does make sense, because my thinking though is that to be a cultural change, it's got to involve the whole culture. Do you know what I mean? Like, we can change the professionals and stuff like that, but if the basic, our culture does not recognize this, then it's kind of like, so I think I agree, we have to start somewhere. but I think sharing stories changes people's perspective.
Absolutely. And you are totally correct. And it is a two-pronged approach. We're just really not there yet, even on a national level. You will see, and I will share a couple of clips, but they're just not publicly disseminated widely yet, that really are short little videos or stories that portray older people in a different manner. Again, we have a long way to go to really get that into the public spheres.
Okay, thank you.
Jen, I had a question on, do you know is there any data with this messaging, how other countries frame the same topic?
Not data per se. There is some, looking at and comparisons of our culture versus other cultures. So this work is really based on American culture and those predominant beliefs in American culture. So this initiative wouldn't be the same in other cultures. We do know that there are cultures that don't have the same misperceptions around aging and that view supports for aging very differently than our culture.
Is that in societies that don't have so much individualism? Like that's the core value of the United States, America. It's all about individuals. Whereas some of these other cultures, it's more a collective, view. So.
Yeah, and that can be part of it. And there are just cultures that are really tied into their cultural beliefs are holding up and revering older people in the way they structure their family life and society and all of that. So it's likely multiple factors. I don't know of a body of research that really breaks it down. The focus here is really on American culture, but great points. Yeah.
There are several things going on in the foreign cultures. China's having a very difficult problem because of their one-child policy, maintaining the fact that the family is responsible for taking care of the older members of the family because there are not enough people. Japan is having a terrible problem on that. They're importing people from Southeast Asia to help carry out their culture. So there's no culture that's right now that's really doing well with the overall aging issue. They're all changing. So I don't think there's a model out there that we can sort of look to say, well, that's what we should adopt to try and solve our particular problem.
Well, I grew up in a little mill town where my grandparents came over from Portugal and Italy after World War I, and everybody pretty much stayed. So within the home, they had upstairs were these relatives, downstairs were these, people were born in the house, people died in the house, and they took care of each other. And, once everybody started moving away, I think that's when different, my generation is, I don't want to be a burden on my children. So how can I set up myself financially so that someday when I am really, can't drive anymore and those things, my independence is slipping away. I'm trying to figure out how do I put a strategy in place now so that I don't feel like a burden. Whereas my grandmothers never even thought about that because my parents stayed, my uncles and aunts stayed, and they remained independent, but they also had this family community. And I went to Spain and Portugal last summer. My daughter spent a semester over there, and you did see that whole extended family network. You saw grandparents holding the hands of their little grandchildren, living in family units. And so I do think there are pockets where that multi-generational living still does happen, and it takes some of the stress away. But I think the cultures you just mentioned, Woody, some of their problems too are that, those kids are saying the world's a big place. I don't want to stay here and take care of my mom or dad, even though culturally that's what I've been taught. The world is a big place. I want to travel. So I think that is just food for thought.
Yep.
It is food for thought. And the you raise up some really good points or good examples. And one of the things that we encourage people is when we talk about aging and we recognize that there have been some shifts in our society, that we also recognize that there may be some structures that we can build in place as our society shifts to accommodate for those changes. So whether there's multi-generational models that are built into our communities that are not family-based, or village models, or again, getting the general public to think of alternative solutions, and that there may be other solutions as well.
I think you've got a little bit of a dilemma here. People don't tend to want to fix problems until there is a crisis. And if you don't emphasize the crisis factor of the growing population, the lack of help for nursing homes, things like this, it's unlikely you're going to move public policy and therefore money into solving these issues. Yet at the same time, you don't want to transmit that sense of crisis to the people who are aging, even though they are going to be affected by it. So making them aware that you are aware of the growing problems, because everybody who's aging now is told, well, there won't be room, there's no Medicaid there, there's not enough beds, there's not enough help. They see the crisis, they see the issues. Aging itself is not a crisis, but the situation surrounding it, I think, is, and making that dichotomy is, I think, a pretty important issue, to make sure it's separated between the people who are actually experiencing it versus the public policy and attracting money and funding and laws pertaining to it.
Those are excellent points, and you've all made excellent points. And so it really goes back to my opening slide, is that, this is not about, one way to communicate. It's really helping to give us information when we make those choices, right? So we now have some research to rely on when we frame and make choices. It's a balance, and it's a long-term, again, that first slide, social change endeavor, because it is a tricky, there's no one. So if I could, I'd put before you that magical piece of communication that would get everyone, and it doesn't work that way. And that's it. You guys are making great observations. So we're not suggesting in our communication that we drop the very real aspects that we are facing with a growing demography, aging population. So I just want to be clear about that. We're not suggesting that whatsoever. We are giving more information for all of us as aging experts and advocates when we are making those framing choices.
Good.
Okay, thank
Jennifer?
you, everybody. Yeah.
Hi. So I understand how language has to change and how we have to really work collectively. But the thing I'm struggling with is, and particularly with our aging population and how things are so fluctuant based on, government whims and, Medicaid and Social Security, and when you say to avoid the real conversation and talk about solution thinking, how would you say we talk about it? It's like, okay, like we formed a community and we're going to support you. I mean, I just, I guess it would be helpful for me if I heard what a story might look like, what it might sound like how would you successfully do that?
Yes, I absolutely understand that. I wanted to clarify one thing. Did
Yes.
I say avoid real conversations?
I have tried to avoid the perceived real.
Okay.
I wrote that down.
Okay, that's
It
helpful for me.
caught my ear, so I just trotted it down.
So when that piece, just to clarify, was really around the observation that folks view aging as either this perceived real or idealized version, right? So that perceived real being wholly bad deterioration, idealized is we're all spending our life in retirement on cruises and drinking cocktails and having fun. My comment was to avoid triggering one end of the spectrum of the other, recognizing that it is a spectrum of aging and we all fall in different places on that spectrum. Because if we tap into one end of that spectrum, we lose half of our audience that doesn't identify with that very extreme part of view of aging. So I just want to clarify that because I was a little nervous when I heard avoid real conversation, because that is, if something in how I said that came across that way, I just did want to clarify that point.
I'm glad you did because that was just a brief note that I wrote, and I'm looking at it and I'm like, avoid real.
No. So scribble that out. Take that out of your notes. That's not what I intended.
Right.
So I wholeheartedly, and so my challenge is really, and I change my presentations all the time and feedback is really welcome. I change them because it's a lot of information. How do I engage people without overwhelming you all? And when I have a time period of 45 minutes, it's really hard for me to give the groundwork and examples. I can follow up out of respect for your meeting time. I can send some examples of before framing communication and after framing, so you can see how some of these recommendations, and some of them are examples from national organizations such as AARP, and in using how they framed it before and after, if that would be helpful. I'm always welcome. I'm always willing to do a part 2 or to do, again, there's 20 of us, so you can reach out to me and engage some of our trainers to come out to your organization and deliver additional presentations, or we can talk about targeted presentations and technical assistance if someone would like that around framing your own communication. That's part of what we're trying to do with our strategy here in New Hampshire.
Jen, do you offer like CEU training sessions as well?
We are working on that. That has come up several times. We are working on that because it has come up. We do a lot at conferences and things like that, but we have not yet offered CEUs, but we are working on that.
I like to piggyback on what Deb said. I would love just like a few examples, just something that I can take tomorrow and hit the grounding with. It was interesting that the phrases older adult and older people were favorable because I don't feel comfortable saying like, oh, I work with older people. I mean, even when I say senior move manager, I pair it with, I work with the more mature adult, and I've gotten a lot of positive feedback from people who are seniors and people who aren't seniors. Not that seniors is a negative term, but just trying to, the response I get, people, oh, you work, we're seniors, like, and not that they don't perceive that as being negative, but you can see a mindset switch. And even working with my clients and trying to help them through their process, they have a very fixed mindset, like all those things you had in there, that those things are just going downhill from here. I mean, the majority of them, I would say, struggle with, well, you don't want to get older because things just go downhill from here. And so trying to change, having a more flexible mindset is important. So I would love a few examples to just like take and start using, because I've found that people remember and they'll say, oh yeah, I'm the more mature adult, So just taking something that, even if we can start in little areas and start spreading that.
Yes, absolutely. And it sounds like you've tapped in and found language already that allows people to include themselves into that group, because you're using mature people and people are more comfortable saying, I'm part of that group. Whereas when we use other language, people are like, that's not me, that's those people over there. So good job. It sounds like you're already doing that. I will send some, as an example, one of the examples I will use is an example in some information about how we talk about frailty. Again, we're not taking frailty and deterioration out because it is part of the spectrum of aging. So how do we use these recommendations and still talk about it? That's a tricky one. So I will send some information specifically about that as well, and examples. And Kelly, so I'll send you quite a bit of follow-up information, and folks can pick and choose from what feels like is most helpful. That might be a plan for moving forward.
I think that's great. I think there's a lot of common synergy between sort of our mission of education and working with your sort of framework. And it's almost like a movement in some ways in how I'm thinking about it, and just societal changes. And so I definitely would love to keep the conversation going. I think we have time for probably 2 more questions. If anyone else has some questions for Jen.
If there are no more questions, I just wanted to thank you all.
I'll make one comment if I can. They
Sure.
use